Wagner has already been had its knees cut under it by what's gone on in Russia. It's what would be prescribed next, what private military company would come next. Because one thing about Wagner and one of its successor organizations, such as Concord, is that it is not really separate from the state.
So, Wagner, the Russian mercenary group, is set to be proscribed as a terrorist group by the UK government. It means it'll be illegal to be a member or to support the organisation. A draft order is to be laid in Parliament, which will allow the assets of the organisation to be categorised as terrorist property and seized. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, said Wagner was violent and destructive, a military tool of Vladimir Putin's Russia. Well, let's talk to Major General Chip Chapman, who is the former head of counter-terrorism at the Ministry of Defence and a former senior British military advisor to US Central Command. Good evening to you, Major General Chapman.
Good evening, Carol.
Really good to have you with us. What do you make of this move by the British government?
I think it's an unusual move in the timing. Wagner's legal status at the moment is unsure. It should have sworn sort of fidelity to the Russian state. So in a sense, it's part of the information war and will really, really annoy the Russians. But whether it will have any practical impact will be another matter. Now, of course, I do think that Wagner, particularly in its overseas activities, particularly in the Sahel, in Mali and Burkina Faso, has acted in a very violent terrorist way. And the nature and scale of its activities would lead you to think that it is a terrorist organization. But there should generally be a specific threat to the UK. But it will deter those who might think about supporting it in the sort of social media domain as much as anything. Whether it will have any practical impact is another thing. I think one of the things to look to for the future is if Wagner has already been had its knees cut under it by what's gone on in Russia, it's what would be prescribed next, what private military company would come next. Because one thing about Wagner and one of its successor organizations, such as Concord, is that it is not really separate from the state. There's always an involvement of the GRU, and indeed the Russian state, when Prigozhin was topped, did say that they'd funded Wagner to the tune of $1 billion. What would be interesting, though, is if the US also prescribe it as a foreign terrorist organization. So has this been synchronized in the Western Alliance?
We're struggling a little bit with your line. We'll keep our fingers crossed that it holds up. Of course, its former leader, the former leader of Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin, died in a plane crash just over a week ago. He'd staged this failed coup in Russia. But Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, in her statement tonight has said Wagner's continuing destabilizing activities only continue to serve the Kremlin's political goals. They are terrorists, plain and simple, and this proscription order makes that clear in UK law. I mean, when we hear about some of the violent acts that members of this organisation are alleged to have been involved in, many people will say that perhaps it's surprising that it's only happening now.
Well, yeah, but there's always geopolitics at play here. So it's part of the Russian state, used as a tool of Russian foreign policy as a private military company. What's it's practically going to achieve by what they've done? So I think it's actually too late in lots of ways in terms of where they sit now. That's why I mention it's what comes next in terms of private military companies, Concord or some other iteration. The functions of Wagner will continue in Africa particularly, and we've seen increased violence where they go. That will be the interesting thing to see if those groups are then prescribed in the future.
And what is it likely to mean? Because, I mean, it's hard to think that there would be many people in the UK that would be supporting such an organisation. But, I mean, is this an organisation which might have assets in this country which could now be seized?
I don't think so, but there are people in the West and in the UK who do see Russia and, the Wagner philosophy as the saviours of Western civilization. There are both people on the extreme right and the extreme left, and certainly there's been compromise of lots of people who give this sort of useful idiots to do with supporting the Russian line and Russian propaganda. So those people will not be able to come out in the open forum to support Russia and the Wagner Group in particular. That's a real tool of prescription that will hit them if those people come out.
Just one final thought on this Wagner Group. We know that its fighters had been playing quite a significant role in certain parts of the front lines in Ukraine. Since the death of Prigozhin, what do we know about whether those fighters are still there and how much of a threat they're still posing to Ukrainian forces?
Well, at the moment, I don't think they pose any threat to the Ukrainian forces. They were incorporated. Their heavy equipment was supposed to go across to the Russian state. And of course, most of their fighters were supposed to go to Belarus. There may still be 5,000 people there. And the legal agreement, which was between Lukashenko and the Wagner Group, is not necessarily transparent. One of the views was, of course, that they may be used on that border to destabilize NATO, particularly in the Baltic states and the Polish border. I think we'll have to wait and see on that. But I think they're absolutely a busted flush. So it's an unusual timing in terms of what's happened.
And just finally, is this likely, do you think, to be seen as the British government trying to be at the forefront of these moves? Do you think we will see the US and perhaps other European NATO allies following suit?
I think we should, because that would be good joined-up international relations. So that would be useful to do. I also think that we'll see a violent reaction from the Russians, particularly in the propaganda sphere, particularly on the ultra-nationalist side and on the ultra-nationalist TV programs, which, of course, are all controlled from the Kremlin.
Major General Chip Chapman, really good to speak to you. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
You're welcome, Carol.